But I want to encourage you again to turn up the volume and take a listen. Because nothing else you hear on the radio, nothing you see on television, nothing else is going to provide you with the information that I think this gentleman does in my conveyance to you. And I can't read it all, but I'm going to read a good chunk of it. He wrote on January 1, 2013, one-third of Republican congressmen, following their leaders, joined with nearly all Democrats to legislate higher taxes and more subsidies for Democratic constituencies. He's talking about this fiscal cliff. Two-thirds voted no, following the people who had elected them. For generations, the Republican Party had presented itself as the political vehicle for Americans whose opposition to ever bigger government financed by ever higher taxes makes them a country class. Yet modern Republican leaders, with the exception of the Reagan administration, have been partners in the expansion of government, indeed in the growth of a government-based ruling class. They have relished that role despite their voters. Thus, these leaders gradually solidified their choice to no longer represent what had been their constituency. He's talking about the Republican Party. But to openly adopt the identity of junior partners in the ruling class. By repeatedly passing bills that contradict the identity of Republican voters and of the majority of Republican elected representatives, the Republican leadership has made political orphans of millions of Americans. In short, at the outset of 2013, a substantial portion of America finds itself unrepresented, while Republican leaders increasingly represent only themselves. By the law of supply and demand, millions of Americans, arguably a majority, cannot remain without representation. Increasingly, the top people in government, corporations, and the media collude and demand submission, as did the royal courts of old. This marks these political orphans as a country class. He's talking about us. In 1776, America's country class responded to lack of representation by uniting under the concept that all men are created equal. In our time, it's disparate sectors. Common sentiment is more like, who the hell do they think they are? Meaning the Republicans and the ruling class. The ever-growing U.S. government has an edgy social, ethical, and political character. It is distasteful to a majority of persons who vote Republican and to independent voters, as well as to perhaps one-fifth of those who vote Democrat. The Republican leadership's kinship with the socio-political class that runs modern government is deep. Country-class Americans have but to glance at the media to hear themselves insulted from on high as greedy, racist, violent, ignorant extremists. Yet far has it been from the Republican leadership to defend them. Whenever possible, the Republican establishment has chosen candidates for office, especially the presidency, who have ignored, soft-pedaled, or given mere lip service to their voters' identities and concerns. Thus, public opinion polls confirm that some two-thirds of Americans feel that government is them, not us, that government has been taking the country in the wrong direction, and that such sentiments largely parallel partisan identification. While a majority of Democrats feel that officials who bear that label represent them well, only about a fourth of Republican voters and an even smaller proportion of independents trust Republican officials to be on their side. Again, while the ruling class is well represented by the Democrat Party, the country class is not represented politically by the Republican Party or by any other. Well or badly, its demand for representation will be met. Representation is the distinguishing feature of democratic government. To be represented, to trust that one's own identity and interests are secure and advocated in high places, is to be part of the polity. In practice, any democratic government's claim to the obedience of citizens depends on the extent to which voters feel they are party to the polity. No one doubts that the absence, loss, or perversion of that function divides the polity sharply between rulers and ruled. As the Democrat Party has grown its constituent parts into a massive complex of patronage, its near monopoly of education has endowed its leaders ever more firmly with the conviction that they are as entitled to deference and prerequisites as they are to ruling. The host of its non-governmental but government-financed entities, such as Planned Parenthood and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, argue for government funding by stating correctly that they're pursuing the public interest as government itself defines it. By the turn of the 21st century, America had a bona fide ruling class that transcends government and sees itself at once as distinct from the rest of society, and is the only element thereof that may act on its behalf. The civilization of the ruling class does not concede that those who resist it, like you and me, have any moral or intellectual right, and only reluctantly any civil right to do so. Resistance is illegitimate because it can come only from low motives. That's their assertion. Obama's statement that Republican legislators, and hence the people who elect them, don't care whether seniors have decent health care, whether children have enough to eat, is typical. Republican leaders neither parry the insults nor vilify their Democratic counterparts in comparable terms because they don't want to beat the ruling class, but to join it in solving the nation's problems. How did they cut such a pathetic figure? How did this come to be? And by the way, not just the elected ones. You can hear this from Joe Scarborough. You can hear it from David Brooks, David Frum, on and on and on. The Republican Party never fully adapted itself to the fact that modern big government is an interest group in and of itself, inherently at odds with the rest of a society, that it creates a demand for representation by those it alienates, and hence that politicians must choose whether to represent the rulers or the ruled. The Republican Party had been the party of government between the Civil War and 1932, but government then was smaller in size, scope, and pretense. The Rockefellers of New York and the Lodges of Massachusetts, much less than the Tafts of Ohio, did not aspire to shape the lives of the ruled, as does modern government. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal largely shut these Republicans out of the patronage and power of modern government. And by the late 1930s, being out of power had begun to make Republicans the default refuge of voters who didn't like what the new big government was doing. Some Republican leaders, the Taft wing of the party, adopted this role, but the Rockefeller wing did not. Though the latter were never entirely comfortable with the emerging Democrat ruling class, the Rockefeller wing big business constituency pressed them to be their advocate to it. A few such Republicans even dreamed during the Nixon-Ford administration of the 1970s that they might replace Democrats as the head of the ruling class. But the die had been cast long since. Corporations, finance, and the entitled high and low, America's ins, gravitated to the Democrats' permanent power, while the outs fled to the Republican fold. Thus, after World War II, the Republican Party came to consist of office holders, most of who yearned to be the ins, and of voters who were mostly the outs. This internal contradiction was unsustainable. The Republican leadership, regarding its natural consistency as embarrassing to the pursuits of a larger role in government, limited its appeal to it. Thus, the Republican leadership gradually cut itself off from the only route of power by which it might gain that role. Thus, the Republicans proved to be the stupid party. His point is, the Republican leadership is utterly disconnected from the Republican base. Now, I want to pursue this further after the break and probably after the bottom of the hour. I hope you'll stay with me. Folks, I'm using this superb article to underscore what I've been trying to communicate and what I know is the future of the Republican Party, and I feel the nation. We are not represented in Washington. You may recall, probably not, many months ago I said it's us versus Obama. It's us versus Congress. The Republican leadership doesn't think about the Constitution the way we do. The Republican leadership doesn't think about the private sector the way we do. The Republican leadership doesn't think about the chaos and the tumult that's being created as we do. They're always positioning themselves. They're fearful of Obama. They don't really stand for anything. And so his point is, and the point I've been trying to make in this battle with Karl Rove and the establishment and the Rinos, which are devouring more and more of these conservative websites and so forth, is they don't represent us because they've joined the other side in too many respects. I'll be right back.
Right versus left is right versus wrong. Call Mark at 877-381-3811.
I have never in my... How many years I've been on the radio, Mr. Producer? Almost 10 years on radio. Have spent this much time reading one article. But so what? I think it's important. This article on Forbes is online. We will link to this, by the way, at marklevinshow.com, and I've linked to it on my social sites, Mark Levin Facebook, Mark Levin Twitter, by Professor Angelo Codavilla. And I want to continue where I left off. He's talking about the ruling class, how the Republican leadership in Washington has thrown in with them. Oh, there's some distinctions, but not enough. And how we, the people, we don't have any representation. And he points out in 1960, Barry Goldwater began the revolt of the Republican Party's constituent outsider, or country class. And by country class, he doesn't mean a bunch of hicks. Country class, he means those of us who live in the country and not inside the Beltway. Goldwater began the revolt of the GOP's constituent outsider, or country class, by calling for a grassroots takeover of the Republican Party. This led to Goldwater's nomination for president in 1964. The Republican establishment maligned him more vigorously than did the Democrats. You can hear this today with Karl Rove attacking a number of Tea Party candidates who do not deserve the smears that he's spewing, and the effort by the Bushes and by others to trash these people and to trash us. As he said, the Republican establishment maligned Goldwater more vigorously than did the Democrats. But the Goldwater movement switched to Ronald Reagan, who overcame the Republican establishment and the ruling class to win the presidency by 2 landslide elections. Yet the question, who or what does the Republican Party represent, continued to sharpen because the Reagan interlude was brief, because it never transformed the Republican Party, and hence because the Bush dynasty plus congressional leadership, Newt Gingrich was a rebel against it and treated as such, behaved increasingly indistinguishably from the Democrats. Government grew more rapidly under these Republican administrations than under Democratic ones. George W. Bush is a perfect example. In sum, the closer one gets to the Republican Party's voters, the more the Republican Party looks like Goldwater and Reagan. The closer one gets to its top, the more it looks like the ghost of Rockefeller. Consider 2012. The party chose for president someone preferred by only 1/4 of its voters, Mitt Romney, whose first youthful venture in politics had been to take part in the political blackballing of Barry Goldwater. It matters less whether 2/3 of Republican congressmen vote against their leaders, as they did on January 1, 2013 at the fiscal cliff, out of conviction or because their constituents demand it. The fact is, Republican leaders become less significant with every passing year because they have no way of reversing the intellectual trends from above or the popular pressure from below. Recent presidential elections have shown that contemporary establishment Republicans elicit scarce, unenthusiastic support, even from longtime Republican voters, because they're out of sync with their flock. And this is what happened to the Whig Party after 1850. after it became undeniable that party leader Henry Clay's latest great compromise had sold the party's principles cheap. The most vigorous Whigs, for example, New York Governor William Seward and national hero John C. Fremont, joined by an obscure Illinois ex-congressman named Abraham Lincoln, whose only asset was that he could reason well, looked for another vehicle for their cause. In 1854, together with representatives of other groups, they founded the Republican Party. Today, the majority of the Republican congressmen, plus a minority of senators, dissidents from the party but solid with their voters, are the natural core of a new party, argues this professor. The name it might bear is irrelevant. Very relevant are sectors of America's population increasingly represented by groups that sprang up to represent them when the Republican leadership did not. Hence the Tea Party. This representation is happening by default. It is aided by the Internet, which makes it possible to spread ideas which the educational establishment gives short shrift and which the ruling class media shun. In short, the Internet helps undermine the ruling class, their near homogenization of American intellectual life, and its closing of the American mind. The Internet also spread the power to organize. Thus, informed with facts and opinions, sectors of the country class have felt represented and empowered vis-a-vis the ruling class. Those on the electronic distribution list of, say, Club for Growth are at least as well informed on economic matters as any credentialed policymaker. The several pro-life organizations have spread enough knowledge of embryology and moral logic to make Roe v. Wade, which the ruling class regards as its greatest victory, a shrinking island in American jurisprudence and society. The countless Tea Parties have sprung up all over. They've added their countless attendees to networks of information and organization, despite the ruling class's effort to demonize them. The same goes for evangelicals, gun owners, etc. Though such groups represent the country class in a fragmented way, country class people identify with them rather than with the Republican Party because the groups actually stand for something and represent their adherence against the ruling class's charges and insults and all the rest. Since America's first past-the-post electoral system produces elections between two parties, it was natural for any and all groups who oppose the ruling class to gravitate to the Republican Party. But the Republican Party's leaders, reasoning that they have nowhere else to go, quote unquote, refused to notice that voters were lending their votes out of allegiance to causes rather than to the party, and that Republican candidates increasingly saw votes through the medium of groups that advocate these causes rather than through the party establishment. And I might add here, this is why Rove is on the counterattack, trying to raise as much money from billionaires as possible to fight off you, to fight off we the people for the Washington Republican establishment that still embraces him, despite his 98% loss record in 2012. They fear you more, ladies and gentlemen, than they fear the radical left-wing Democrats out there. The party establishment was shocked when candidates won Republican primaries by aligning themselves with groups that believe in these causes against the Republican Party itself. The flood of votes that such groups energized in 2010 signified that the groups, not the party, had come to represent opposition to the ruling class. But since 2010, the Republican leadership continued to pretend to be the country class representative while not actually representing it. Its donors buried opposition to Mitt Romney in attack ads and picked its own kind of candidates wherever it could. After the Republican leadership's electoral disaster of 2012 and its subsequent pathetic fecklessness, the only vision of a possible future in Republican ranks, the only pragmatic and organizational coherence was among the party's dissident majority in the House and dissident minority in the Senate. By 2013, today, it was less meaningful to ask what the leadership would do with the dissidents than what the dissidents would do with the leadership. The answer seemed to be increasingly to ignore the leadership, to go their own way, more and more to go along with conscience and with voters. By 2013, as their numbers continued to grow without counter-trend, it was difficult to imagine how the Republican leadership might reduce their numbers. At the same time, the groups that believe in principle, that represent the country class's pieces, were mounting and winning more primary challenges to establishment Republicans. The establishment responded with its main asset, money. The New York Times reported a concerted effort by the party's biggest donors, led by longtime Bush staffer Karl Rove, yes, the Rockefeller wing of the Republican Party, to support establishment candidates in the primary process. But establishment candidates are already better funded than the dissidents, usually massively so. The establishment candidates who have survived dissident challenges have seldom done it through sheer cash, but rather by fuzzing the differences between themselves and the dissidents. And hence, ladies and gentlemen, Karl Rove giving a phony, fraudulent name to his group, calling it conservative. The professor concludes, a new party is likely to arise because the public holds both Republicans and Democrats responsible for the nation's unsustainable course. Indebtedness cannot increase endlessly, nor can regulations pile on top of regulations while the officials who promulgate them and their pensions continue to grow without crushing those of us who are beneath them. Nor can the population's rush to disability status and other forms of public assistance, or the no-win wars that have resulted in open season on Americans around the world, continue without catharsis. One half of the population cannot continue to passively absorb insults without pushing back. When sooner rather than later, events collapse this house of cards. It will be hard to credibly advocate a better future while bearing a label that advertises responsibility for the present. To represent the country class, that is we the people, to set about reversing the ills the ruling class imposed on America, a party would have to confront the ruling class's pretenses with unity and force comparable to that by which they were imposed. There will be no alternative to all the country class's various components acting jointly on measures dear to each. This gentleman has given up on the Republican Party because of the Republican leadership. He says it doesn't represent anything or anyone in large numbers anymore. The Republican leadership doesn't even represent in the House 2/3 of the Republican members. And in the Senate, the Republican leadership is representing, he argues, a smaller and smaller group of Republicans there. And his point is that those of us who believe in gun rights, those of us who believe in traditional marriage, those of us who believe in fiscal responsibility, those of us who believe in the Constitution, those of us who are believers in the American heritage will go elsewhere. And in 2012, he believes millions of us decided the hell with both parties and chose not to show up. He says the country class, to defend itself, to cut down the forest of subsidies and privileges that choke America, to curb the arrogance of modern government, cannot shy away from offending the ruling class's intellectual and moral pretenses, which, of course, the Republican leadership does day and day, worried about offending them. Events themselves show how dysfunctional the ruling class is. But only a political party worthy of the name can marshal the combination of reason, brutal images, and consistency adequately to represent America's country class. I have warned here the Republican Party that if it doesn't embrace conservative American founding principles, it will destroy itself. It won't destroy us, we the people. We're not going anywhere. It will destroy itself. And I think you'll agree, at least when it comes to this profession, at least when it comes to my books and so forth and my articles, I've been out there saying over and over again, we cannot survive this Republican leadership. We cannot survive the Karl Roves and the Bush dynasty, either as a Republican Party or as a nation. We just can't. You and the Republican Party that lead it in Washington and lead it in our state capitals, you're running out of time. You either stick with us. Better said, you either join with us or you're finished.
Mark Levin.